Hi, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to The Killing State, Confronting the Normalization of State Violence in the Philippines. As my colleague Christian explained earlier, we're holding this as a side event for the Human Rights Council 48. We'd also like to thank our co-organizers, Forum Asia, Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, Fasten Upfer, and Franciscans International. First, we'd like to thank the participation of our colleagues from the UN and the diplomatic community, thanking the European Union, embassies of Canada, Mexico, Norway, and our international partners, Geneva for Human Rights and the Danish Institute for Torture, and as well as the OHCHR. So my name is Joy. I'm from Forum Asia, and I will be moderating this event for the next hour and a half. We have with us also human rights defenders and civil society here from the Philippines who have continued to raise the human rights violations in the country and to call for accountability. We would like to use this side event to update partners, diplomatic partners, particularly in the Human Rights Council, of the human rights situation in the Philippines, particularly within the last 5 years, and call for a robust UN Human Rights Council resolution to mandate an independent and international investigation. Also, as my colleague mentioned, we're being broadcast on YouTube and Facebook, and we're also being broadcast to a Sorry about that. I think that was my technical problem. So during the last 5 years, President Duterte has enabled the normalization of violence and impunity. As in previous years, 2021 was a year of bloodshed and widespread trampling of human rights, made worse by a mismanaged pandemic response. To provide us with an overview of their documentation on the human rights violations, we have Dr. Nina Pimentel Simbulan, who is chair of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates and the executive director of PhilRights, the research arm of PARA. She's also currently the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs in the University of the Philippines, Manila, and is a professor of the University of the Philippines. Dr. Simbulan has led research on human rights violations and will discuss more about this with us for the next 15 minutes. Dr. Simbulan?
Thank you, Joy. Greetings and a pleasant day to everyone. To the representatives of the UN Human Rights Council, member states' capitals, representatives of Geneva missions, to our friends from the diplomatic community here in the Philippines, our international partners who helped us organize this event, and to our audience watching this live on YouTube and Facebook, a pleasant day. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today in our second side event, coinciding with the 48th session of the UN Human Rights Council. This past Monday, we heard from our colleagues their insights and analysis on the state of human rights defenders in the Philippines. For this particular side event, my colleagues and I intend to expand the discussion by tackling the overall human rights situation in the Philippines with specific focus on the prevalence of violence as a state policy, the derogation and worsening conditions of economic, social, and cultural rights of Filipinos, and finally, the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates' recommendations on how we can all work together to urgently address these issues. I would like to use my time to highlight the human rights analysis and research conducted by the Philippine Human Rights Information Center, or PhilRights, the research and information arm of PARA, through reports the institution has published under the Killing State banner. Let me begin by highlighting the fact that President Duterte has made it clear from the very start that he intended to use his presidency to further the kill policies he instituted as mayor of the city of Davao. The so-called war on drugs, put in place in 2016, has precipitated a full-blown human rights crisis that has expanded to include wide-ranging attacks against human rights defenders, activists, critics, members of progressive organizations, the mass media, and basic sectors. Through the documentation work done by PhilRights and other human rights organizations on extrajudicial killings and other human rights violations perpetrated in the context of the so-called war on drugs, we were able to collect data, record statements, and compile stories of witnesses, families left behind, of 100 alleged victims of extrajudicial killings and 47 alleged victims of other human rights violations, such as illegal arrest and detention, enforced disappearances, and torture. What the data reveal are the so-called war on drugs is a war against the poor. The victims documented have mostly come from urban poor sector. Their profile tends to be male adults, often family breadwinners, earning low and or irregular wages. This last fact is important. On the average, a victim contributed around 40% of the household income. So their deaths have significant negative repercussions for the families left behind, on top of the trauma of losing a loved one experienced by families. Altogether, the 180 documented victims left behind 279 children. Almost half of the documented killings occurred in police operations or while the victims were under police custody. The rest were killed in unofficial operations, which informants or witnesses allege were conducted by police or by unidentified assailants or vigilantes. Almost all documented victims bore gunshot wounds. 1 in 4 allegedly endured signs of torture, including beatings, dismemberment, broken limbs, missing fingernails, and burn marks. These 180 killings, to say nothing of the thousands of other cases not covered by our study, deserve to be investigated. Yet, we only know of 12 cases where police conducted the victims' families for an investigation. This is a gross failure on the part of the state to guarantee due process and afford protections against misuse of force by state security agents. What's more, we regularly receive reports from our community partners of efforts by the police to harass, pressure, or at the very least, discourage families of EJK victims from filing cases and complaints against perpetrators. There is also clear intent to muddle the truth about the implementation of the so-called war on drugs. Apart from insisting on the nanlaban narrative, where police and government officials proclaim that those killed fought back, there are also documented cases of erroneous or misdeclared information on death certificates of extrajudicial victims. Among our cases, we have seen 10 EJK victims who were described as having died from cardiac arrest, myocardial infarction or heart arrest, pneumonia or acute respiratory distress syndrome. 3 in 4 of the families documented have reported difficulty in accessing or securing official documents of their dead relatives, especially police and medical legal reports. The sheer number and violence of these killings occurring since 2016 have created a culture of fear and insecurity in many urban poor communities. This highlights one important fact about the so-called war on drugs. The impacts of EJKs are multidimensional and interrelated. Families left behind reported a deterioration in the quality of life, especially in terms of livelihood, food security, physical and mental health, and children's education. Allow me also to address a question that always gets asked about why the so-called war on drugs and terrorism appear to have public support. There are many ways to look at this question and even more ways to answer it. However, a key factor that enabled all of this is that President Duterte and his allies have succeeded in their efforts to distort, misrepresent, and villainize human rights. The use of terror tactics in the form of threats and harassments have proven to be effective in sowing fear and silencing sections of the population. This administration has painted a negative picture of human rights and human rights defenders in rhetoric and action. At work is a wide-ranging application of President Duterte's core principle of governance, which is based on violence. By framing civic participation as a destabilizing force, painting a broad red brush against individuals and groups who dare to bear the truth about the abuses and violations occurring in many parts of the country, and weaponizing the law against civil society and media, civic spaces in the Philippines have essentially shrunk to conditions comparable, if not worse, to martial law era. And so it bears repeating. We are in a human rights crisis, one that has caused and is continuing to cause suffering and will have manifold impacts in the years to come. The damage not only on the meltdown of democratic safeguards, but also on civic behavior will be long-term. With this in mind, we call upon our friends in the international community to stand in solidarity with us in our efforts to curtail the growth of this malignant force. It all starts with a united stance in seeking an impartial, independent, international investigation into the human rights situation in the Philippines. Let me end by sharing you a few messages from some of the families and loved ones left behind by EJK victims. We acknowledge that these engagements must always include their voices, their aspirations, and here are some of their messages. Next slide, please. Hello, I am glad you are among those helping us achieve the justice we are yearning for. I hope you do not stop helping us families of victims of EJKs, and I hope you do not give up on us and stay with us until the end. Thank you. Next slide. Good morning to the leadership of the UN Human Rights Council. My wish is for an investigation to be conducted on the merciless killing of my son, who was sleeping at the time he was murdered. I hope those responsible will be held accountable for all their crimes, since he sat, referring to President Duterte, in office, these heinous killings started occurring. Thank you very much. Good morning to the leadership of the UNHRC. I am thankful for this opportunity to share my grievances. I wish for an investigation into the merciless killing of my innocent mother. Since my mother's death 5 years ago, the perpetrators have continued to go scot-free. I hope you can help me get justice and hold the perpetrators accountable, particularly government agents who are the masterminds of these killings. Thank you very much. I am a senior citizen living blank. My son and grandchild are both victims of EJK, killed without mercy by unknown assailants. I wish that their senseless deaths be given justice, and not just for me, but for other victims' families. Their sudden deaths are painful for us, and so we hope the UNHRC will conduct a fact-finding mission in the Philippines to expose human rights violations and for us to achieve justice. Thank you very much. I am living in, two of my children are victims of EJKs, while one child remains missing until now because of the war on drugs of the Duterte government. I want the ICC to proceed with its investigation in our country and for a fact-finding mission to be conducted by the United Nations Human Rights Council in the Philippines to surface the gross human rights violations so we can claim justice. I think there will be genuine justice if the perpetrators are held accountable for what happened to my children and grandchild and all other victims' families like mine. It would be good if there are other ways to seek justice for all EJK victims. This would help greatly, especially since the government's position is that no one will be held accountable among its supporters and allies. I hope an investigation will help all the victims of war on drugs in achieving the justice they seek. Thank you for listening, and good day again to everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nina, for discussing your research on the victims of extrajudicial killings and the victims of the president's war on drugs, and also for highlighting the long-lasting impact of these violations to their lives and also their families and also their communities, and also for connecting that to the war on dissent and also the war against civil society and free expression. And also, thanks for sharing with us the messages of the victims. We think it's very important that these messages are heard, and that in our pursuit for accountability, victims are heard, and that they take the lead in the pursuit for justice. So thank you to Phil Rights and to Dr. Nimia for facilitating the sharing of these messages. And also, as a reminder, if our friends and colleagues have questions or comments, please feel free to share in the chat box and our speakers will address them later. We'll go to our second speaker. So our second speaker is Ms. Rowena Legaspi, who is Executive Director of Children's Legal Rights and Development Center, or CLRDC. CLRDC has documented the children affected and victimized by the war on drugs. In June 2020, CLRDC, together with OMCT, published a report on the extrajudicial killings of children in the war on drugs. So Ms. Wang will discuss with us Duterte's legacy and the long-lasting impact of this period. Thank you, Ms. Wang. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers of this side event, and warm greetings everyone to the international human rights communities present here today, to our local human rights networks, and to the diplomatic community, and most of all, to the families of victims of human rights violations who are right now watching and joining us through live streaming in Facebook, and this is for you. I was tasked to discuss Duterte's legacy of violence, and I really don't know where to start as I continue to grapple with the stress it gives me every time I think about the legacy of violence, let alone the thought that anyone who would continue to speak about human rights situation would be vilified. But who will? The truth must prevail. And my colleagues here have substantiated enough also, no, especially Doc Nimia. But let me focus on other important issues in the hallmark of Duterte legacy, his kill, kill, kill policy from day one of his administration. First, the kill policy in drug war. The killings that took place in the Duterte administration's drug war were shaped by the circulars and issuances despite their apparent constitutional infirmities. For example, the questionable Memorandum Circular number 16, 2016, issued by the Department of Interior and Local Government, where it launched President Duterte's War on Drugs, which is formally called Project Double Barrel. Its mission to the Philippine National Police is to clear all drug-affected village across the country, conduct no-let-up operations against illegal drug personalities, and dismantle drug syndicates. And subsequent regulation has been issued by the Dangerous Drug Boards to supplement this memo circular by the DILG, in order to address the vulnerabilities on human rights which became more apparent during the latter's implementation. And both issuances did not differentiate between a user and a pusher when the Dangerous Drug Act clearly distinguished between the two and have separate penalties for each. And the execution of these two circulars has resulted in more than 27,000 extrajudicial killings since July 2016. But the Philippine National Police data claimed otherwise, and they said they only had 8,000 killed, according to their record, which they call death under investigation. So in the kill policy of Duterte, the children were not spared and became part of the targets. And I always say this, these are children who are below 18 years old. The president said that his reason for the drug war is to protect the children and our future generations. But who are his future generations? By the method the drug war is implemented, the president seems to be very selective of the future generations that he wanted to protect. As of June 2021, there were already 150 recorded cases of children killed in drug war. From July 2016 to December 2016, there were 28 children killed. In year 2017, there were 46. In year 2018, there were 25. In year 2019, there were 23. In year 2010, 10 children. 2020, 10 children. And from January to June 2021, we have verified 18 cases already of minors who were killed this year. We have published a report on this available in the website of the World Organization Against Torture. Not only the orphaned mothers who lost their children I have also met children who witnessed the killing of their parents in front of them. They shared that they continue to live in fear and nightmares, and some children I have spoken with who lost their parents to drug war have been separated from their siblings. Their custody was distributed to different relatives, and some children wanted revenge in their hearts. Now, I also spoke with children who attempted suicide, and the future of these children that the president talked about were stolen and taken away from them by these drug war policies that talk about preserving the future generations. That is Duterte's legacy to drug war kill policy. Families in mourning, seeking justice. And moreover, gross human rights violations have become rampant amid the pandemic. And it has exacerbated through the government police measures to quarantine violators, whether old or young, resulting to traumatize Filipinos. Another legacy, second, is weaponizing the law, no, the war on terror through the Anti-Terror Act of 2020 that was enacted. Duterte has likewise used laws and issuances to put a semblance of legitimacy to his authoritarian rule. For instance, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is a direct threat not only to human rights advocates but to ordinary Filipinos because it encroaches upon basic and constitutionally guaranteed freedoms enjoyed in a democratic society, such as freedom of expression and right to dissent. For example, um, the two indigenous people, no, Japper Guru and Junior Ramos, were the first, no, to experience the dangers of this law when they were charged with a violation of the anti-terror law. They were eventually acquitted by the court, but not after their traumatic ordeal. Prior to this, Executive Order 70, Memorandum number 32 were also issued not only to combat terrorism and insurgency, but to indiscriminately target human rights activists and crack down organizations perceived to be critical of Duterte and his administration. The Philippine government utilizes both this war on drugs and war on terror as scapegoats in waging war against government critics and political dissenters, including human rights defenders. And the kind of terrorist labeling against human rights activists gives a blanket authority for political repression measures. The human rights defenders are the ones providing intervention to families of victims of drug war, including children, no, were killed. Another legacy is the strengthening of the impunity. The war on drugs has created a culture of fear and impunity, especially in the urban poor communities, as the president vowed no justice for more than 20,000 deaths. He said that drug addicts are not humans, and this was published, no, by newspapers, no, by the mainstream media when he said that in public. Hence, it becomes imperative for the families of victims of extrajudicial killings to pursue international independent investigation before the International Criminal Court. The mothers whose children were killed have started to consolidate themselves, finding support with each other, and mothers who are similar in similar situation. And as the killings were subjected to the preliminary examination by the ICC, no, related to the war on drugs, Duterte has made a decision to withdraw its ratification of the Rome Statute, avoiding accountability that even more reinforced the culture of impunity, as the ICC investigation now would only cover the period July 2016 to March 2019. How about the killings that took place beyond March 2019? So the government of the Philippines has repeatedly shown unwillingness to prosecute the killings under the drug war. Instead, he has justified the killings in his public speeches and announced the continuance of his state policy of killing, thanks to the Media Bureau of the President, no, the PCCO. These are all downloadable, these speeches. And another, the legacy of that democratic institutions are under attack, no, is the war on drugs continuously contribute to the erosion of the rule of law, democratic institutions in the Philippines is increasingly under attack, if not completely undermined. Checks to executive power are weakened as the other co-equal branch of the government, the legislative and the judiciary for that matter, they have been hijacked by the political allies of the president. Even judicial independence is now questioned. Democratic space is shrinking, and attacks against human rights defenders are on the rise. Press freedom is under attack. There were many journalists who were already killed, no? And there were also, at least by the data of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, there were already more than 65 lawyers who were killed. No? The Duterte's legacy is a violent state. We are not only in the COVID-19 pandemic, we are also in the midst of a death squad pandemic. As the drug war continues, the killings also continue. There is an infestation of fake news and distorted human rights concept to break the fabric of society's moral fiber. So the people have denounced these atrocities, no, that created a climate of terror and a climate of fear, especially among the poor, and especially that all the wars on drugs and terrors have become war against the poor people, so to speak. Having said that, we respectfully call the UN Human Rights Council to establish an independent international investigation into all allegations of gross human rights violations, especially of children, including extrajudicial killings, torture, and forced disappearance, and arbitrary detention that particularly affect children in the context of the war on drugs. And we also recommend to continue to monitor the situation, the human rights situation of the Philippines, and also call on the Philippine government to pass the Human Rights Defenders Bill, no, which is now pending in Congress. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Wang. For your intervention also on how this violence will have a long-lasting impact and how it has left in its wake mourning families all over the country. You also noted how the war on drugs has created a culture of impunity and fear, and we will continue to feel the impact of that in the coming years. Also, how this has led to a war on dissent, war against journalists, against people who criticize the government and his policies, and also wanted to raise a point you also shared, which Dr. Nimia also shared earlier, that this war on drugs is a state policy that has been initiated by the highest has been initiated in the highest levels of government since 2016 when Duterte came in power. While we wait for our third speaker, we thought it might be good to start the open forum now. And if you have questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box, or you can also speak if you'd like. That's definitely possible. Perhaps I can call on Joel to share some comments to our speakers.
Yes, good afternoon. Sorry for barging in on the discussion. But I'm someone who, on my own, but with some support, no? I've been helping EJK victims, and I just like to quickly share some illustrative cases that show, contrary to what Harry Roque, Sal Panelo, and DOJ Secretary Guevara are saying, that we have a fully functioning legal system, etc., no? That as if it means they don't the country doesn't need any ICC intervention or what. Actually, among the cases the families I support, it's very clear, no, that actually the opposite is true. So I'll just give the cases quickly, and I'll just say it in the first person as if I'm from the family, no. So first, the one I wrote on the comments, my husband is jailed and I've been always vocal. I don't even hide. And I've been calling for justice for my son, no, who died, who was killed in a massacre of 5. And why is this the second time my husband is jailed for Cara E. Cruz? No? So is this pressure so that the family will drop the effort, no, to seek justice? Or number two is even, I don't know which of these 5 cases might be called the worst. I have a decision on the EJK from a higher court, from the Court of Appeals, and up to now, this is with finality ever since April of 2019, and up to now, it seems the PNP has not acted on it. Even if the decision of the higher court said, really named the policemen who must be charged, who must be punished, etc. No? My only consolation is that I have a protection order from the Supreme Court. But that Court of Appeals decision, which is since there's no idea on the whatever has happened, no, to it. Or number three, a living person, no? Not an EJK, but I was wrongly accused. There was a huge gap and a lack of evidence. I ended up still in jail for over a year and a half. And the only reason I got free was because I pleaded guilty to the charges. When actually there was no drug shown, no nothing. Nothing was ever proven. And in many of the hearings, the police did not even arrive. There was no representative. And yet the case could not be thrown out. And does this mean that the talk was, because this is a Quezon City case, the prosecutors are scared to dismiss drug cases because later on they might be followed by those people on the motorcycles. And four, my case is one of the early cases, very early cases. My husband and his father were killed right inside the jail. And still there's a big story that they tried to grab the guns of the policemen. And since first quarter 2017, this is already filed in the regional trial court. And there's been a warrant for arrest. But the 2 guilty cops have never been found. And is there really an effort to find them? So much so that the warrant of arrest is now already archived and set aside, basically. No? Or 5, I'm only 15 years old and I was jailed. And I'm a female, a 15-year-old female, and I was jailed for drugs. So that's just a sample, no, of how. No, there's no, and this government admin, all we can say, Kian de los Santos, Kian de los Santos, again and again. One single case. Well, right now, I'm just a small player here. I'm not a big NGO or what, and I can give you 5. That shows that, no way, the legal process is not working.
Thank you very much for sharing of five cases.
Thank you.
Ask that this is
Joy, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you, Joel, for the 5 cases that you have shared with us. Perhaps I can also ask Weng, perhaps any reactions to that? Do you see any similarities in the cases you have also documented, and any comments on Joel's points? I think you're muted, Weng.
Yes, hello. Actually, I agree with Joel, no, based on the cases that we have documented, no. And when we document, we really verify and check with the families, no. There were similar stories, and the narrative of Nanlaban uh, is really the narrative of the state agents, no, because that's the reason why the families of the victims brought the cases, to the ICC, because here there was no really genuine investigation, that was conducted. There was one case. Yes, they always say it's Kian, Kian, Kian. Okay, it's a one case because it was caught by a CCTV, no, and the others, no, they know there is a pattern now that before an operation um, would be conducted, they turned off the CCTV or put it off, no? So that's the reason why there are no other cases that prospered. Aside from that of Kian, of course, there are, like, according to the cases that reached the ICC, there were at least 27,000, no? So out of the 27,000 killings, there was only one conviction. So it's imperative that the families, no, seek the um, independent investigation through the ICC, and by the result of the um, by the decision that was just released by the ICC, no, it came to a conclusion that these killings that took place under the war on drugs was indeed a crime against humanity, and it needs to be investigated.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wang. Dr. Nina, do you also want to react to the cases that Joel shared? And yeah.
Okay. First of all, I'd just like to share to the body that the latest documentation report of PhilRights covering 180 victims, alleged victims of extrajudicial killings in the context of the so-called war on drugs under the Duterte government will be out soon. And this is actually born out of the intensive documentation done by PhilRights staff on the ground in close coordination with community workers and community monitors who are in the different urban poor communities, lending their support and assistance to the investigation and data gathering done by PhilRights staff. I'd also like to add that based as borne out by the documentation report of the Philippine Human Rights Information Center, the issue of neutralizing suspected people involved in the drug trade or the drug industry has never been to arrest them, no, be able to arrest them alive. The intention from the very start has been to kill or assassinate these small-time peddlers or suspected victims involved in the drug war. And what would be a proof, no? A proof or evidence borne out by our documentation report. The 180 cases which we have been able to document thoroughly with matching audiovisual recording, for many of them, we have established certain patterns. For instance, most of the 180 cases born gunshot wounds. And the gunshot wounds that they were in, that the victim sustained, at least 3. There were 3 gunshot wounds, and most of these gunshot wounds were sustained in the head and upper torso. So you can see that based on the aiming of law enforcement agencies, there was really an intention to kill. No? It was really intended to be fatal. And many of these cases were conducted during what have been referred to as by-bus operations or police operations. In some cases, they were suspected to also be police operations because those people who were involved in the operations were in civilian clothes, but were known to the members of the community or to the witnesses to be members of the police force operating in the area. No? So also I'd like to emphasize, which I have highlighted in my presentation, the misdeclaration or erroneous indication of information as shown in the death certificates of a number of cases. For instance, we were able to get hold of 10 death certificates of EJK victims where there was a misdeclaration of the cause of death by saying that the cause of death was due to cardiac arrest, heart attack, or myocardial infarction, pneumonia, or acute respiratory distress syndrome, when all of them sustained gunshot wounds in different parts of the body and in more often than not, fatal. So I really believe that there is really a big area for investigation and for truth to come out, no, in the context of the so-called war on drugs. And may I just point out that this particular government, no, really has a proclivity or inclination to view societal issues and societal problems using the perspective of war, using the war perspective. And that's the reason why the tendency in addressing issues and problems in Philippine society is to make use of state violence. This has been seen in the war against illegal drugs, in the declared war against terrorism, and during the first quarter of 2020, in the war against the COVID-19 pandemic. So all of this have been handled through the use of excessive state violence. And it is not surprising why there is an escalation and worsening of the human rights situation in the country.
Thank you for that very important details on the research, Dr. Nimia. And I think it also adds evidence to the findings of the 2020 OACHR report, which raised issues about inconsistencies on the narratives of the police. And we think that data would really be very useful towards the advocacy of civil society in the Philippines, and also for the international community to keep pushing for accountability on the war on drugs, and also for raising the narrative of the war narrative, and how that has been applied not just to the war on drugs, but also to COVID, and also a war against dissent and civic space. I received another question, and I think this is also I think Wang touched on this earlier, but with the ICC investigation which is coming up, what is the need still for a Human Rights Council investigation? Does anyone want to take this on? Madam, Dr. Nimia?
I think it's very important. I mean, right now, the Filipino people really need the support of everyone in the international community. So I think even if the ICC, which I am not so hopeful really or optimistic really, will be able to proceed with the investigation, the efforts that will be conducted by the UN Human Rights Council in the conduct of an independent fact-finding mission will be able to, hopefully will be able to corroborate, no, or affirm the investigation or the cases that will be heard by the ICC. All the more will make human rights defenders and the human rights movement in the Philippines claim what they have earlier and consistently been asserting, no? That the perpetration of gross human rights violations, both civil and political, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. And I think that's very important to highlight, especially in the coming important events in the country. And I am referring none other to the presidential elections in 2022.
Thank you, Dr. Nimia. Weng, you wanted to say something?
Yes. There is a nexus between the ICC and the Human Rights Council, no? Because instead of dissipating the responsibility, it should make the council or the Human Rights Council members more responsible in terms of responding to the Philippines, because the ICC investigation would only focus on the period where it has jurisdiction. The investigation would focus from the July 16, 2016, when with Duterte took into power, and then until March 16, 2019, when the effectivity of our withdrawal from our ratification of the Rome Statute. And also, that's why the Human Rights Council should be more also responsible in terms of calling for investigation of the killings beyond this period. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Weng. One other question that came up on the Q&A. So there's a UN joint program that will last 3 years. What are your views on this? And how can it help provide justice for victims?
Can you repeat that, Joy?
There is a UN joint program from this was from the resolution, the technical assistance resolution. How will this support the pursuit of justice for the victims?
Rena, you want to take that?
Yeah. On the joint program, we always say that the joint program really does not equal the gravity of human rights violations that is happening in the Philippines, and it does not address the root cause, the structure. So in the joint program, we are encouraged to work with government, but human rights defenders are attacked, no? So how do we work on this if there's a continuous human rights violation and we cannot see the seriousness or the sincerity of implementing this joint program, no? The intention is good, no? But let us see how they conduct this joint program.
There's also a question on the chat box about the role of the CHR. What is the role of the CHR? Dr. Nimia?
Consistently, the Commission on Human Rights has been lending its support to the best of its ability, in terms of providing support to victims, families left behind of victims of EJK, material, financial, legal, as well as psychosocial support to the families. And I think that has greatly helped the human rights community, human rights NGOs in sustaining its work among families of victims of EJK. They have also lent support in terms of doing lobby work in the international community so that an international, impartial, independent investigation can be conducted in the country. to really help in surfacing the truth of what is happening in the Philippines when it comes to the human rights situation. So I would say that the Commission on Human Rights, the commissioners as well as its staff have served as partners, no? Partners of human rights defenders and human rights organizations in the country. I mean, despite the attacks and the threats that they have received from the current government.
Thank you, Dr. Nina. Wang, do you want to? Joel wanted to speak. Go, Joel.
I'm saying this also as a former consultant of the CHR, no, for more than 2 years for the office of the chairman. For those who are listening, especially in the Philippines, I think one thing that we should press, and I've been saying this, and a number of people have been saying this to them. One thing that the CHR really needs is some sort of a position wherein there is a person who is like a case expediter, because oftentimes they lack follow-up, no? And there should be somebody who does the quarterbacking of information within the CHR, so that the response is more shall we say up to date or more timely, no? Because oftentimes until the victims cry out and ask for the follow-up is not there, no? Especially since we're talking about so many cases. So basically, the CHR offices really got swamped, no? Because literally they didn't have enough people to handle all the, no? So there should be really a position developed where there's somebody who reminds all the others, no? Case A has a hearing tomorrow. Case B, by the end of the week, we're going to do a site inspection, etc., etc. No? Because otherwise, it's there's so much internal push and pull about which case to go after, etc., etc. Yun lang po. I think that is one structural thing that sana they... I'm glad just now when we started, actually one of them called me up because about the matter of the jailed father, no, of the EJK victim. So at least nowadays things are quite fast. But I have to say, in the early years of the Duterte administration, there was a big cloud of limbo sometimes, no, with regards how to be more on point. That's all.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Joel. That. And perhaps wait, is there any?
Just a quick rejoinder about what Nimia mentioned about the cause of death. Just this week, right, on Monday, it is Duterte himself who is claiming that the cause of death is being manipulated. And I'd like to say this as an encouragement to everybody, because Duterte said that I'm preparing for my ICC defense, and towards the end he quipped, "Don't blame everything on me, even those people who die of malaria." The very next day, I was actually inside Payatas, and Payatas, Quezon City, one of what we might say is a killing fields, of the and someone there whom I have not, a stranger, I have not talked to her before, who was near one of the sites where a number of people were killed in the past, came up and said, "Oh sir, hindi yan namatay sa malaria ha." So I was really like, wow, that was just last night, and this woman listened to it and she has a reaction to it. No? So let's not be too disheartened that as if, especially the poor, the ones who got victimized, the people in the areas where these things happen, they are not sold to the whole propaganda. No? So I was really, I couldn't, I had a hard time hiding my smile. No? That wow, she was aware of what Duterte said, and she has a comment about it. No? They didn't die of malaria. The people here, no, the ones you're asking about now. So just sharing lang po.
Thank you for that. Let me put my mic. Um, can you hear me? Doc,
There is an echo, Joy.
I think it's from my computer. Yeah. So thank you for that, Joel. Also, I think that's a good reminder. Often we look at families as victims, but all throughout these 5 years, they have really led also the pursuit of accountability. They have been frontlining it despite the risks of reprisals. And I think that's also a great point for our friends and partners from the international community to make sure also that they are heard and that they lead this process. And also, I know you're speaking as a victim advocate, so thank you also for that. We have another question from someone who is who is a family of a victim, and the question is, what will happen to Duterte and his cohorts if proven guilty? I'm assuming this is the ICC investigation. Will they be put behind bars forever? I think this is also the question that victims are raising over this past few years. So yeah.
Yeah. I would like to update on that. Well, we cannot say at this stage because there will still be a long process, no. There will be an investigation, and the victim section did not specifically say how long will the investigation will take place, no. So at this time, we do not want to pin hope, no, to the families of victims, but uh, uh, given the huge amount of evidences that were already sent, no, since the time of preliminary examination, including the videos, no, the CCTV footages and everything, no, given the voluminous information attached with these are evidence-based report, no, submitted to the ICC, no, I think we will see, no, the light at the end of the tunnel. But at this moment, do not want to pin hope to the families of victims. But if they continue to participate, no, despite the threats on the ground, because since the Duterte administration heard about this ICC, there some agencies of the government are now doing some threats, no, to the families of victims, no, and these were already reached the ICC because well, our organization is one of those involved in the coordinating, no, with the families of victims, as well as civil rights also, and been coordinating with the BPRS. So it's going to be a long process, so we cannot tell at this stage. But if we can, no, coordinate and continue to participate as families of victims, then yes, we will see that.
Dr. Nina? Thank you for that, Wang, and thank you for also emphasizing that it will still be a long process. And it's been 5 years since Duterte came to power, and I think our friends here have continued to support civil society and victims. And we do hope that in this long process, you continue to do that, monitor the situation, and just continue to ask for accountability. We have been told that our third speaker unfortunately had an emergency that he had to go to. So I hope we don't have questions anymore. I think we've gone through our questions, but I guess this is the time for me to just thank everyone and also just do a quick wrap up. So Dr. Nimia raised the results of their research, which further highlighted the the narratives of the police that do not really align with the narratives of those who have really experienced these violations on the ground. Dr. Nimia and Ms. Weng also raised how this is not just a side effect of a campaign against drugs, but really it's it's state sponsored. It has been initiated at the highest levels of government ever since we saw Duterte come to power. And we also discussed how this will have a long-lasting impact. In the past 5 years, we have seen how it has gone beyond a war on drugs to a war on dissent, war against everyone, war against human rights defenders, and then war against civic space. And now it's a war against COVID, which is technically a war against the poor. I know we've had so many discussions also on human rights in the Philippines, but we also feel that this is necessary for us to keep pushing for justice, because as Ms. Wang said, it's going to be a long process, and we definitely need the international community to stand by us in this process. Just also to raise that as we go on, I think it has been important for us to hear about the messages coming from the victims themselves. And I think also it also reminds us that when we talk about violations in the Philippines, we often refer to the numbers, thousands who have been killed, many more who have been orphaned. But I think these messages also puts us back into the essence that behind these numbers are real families, real communities that have been ripped apart, and real individuals who have lost their loved ones, and who continue to suffer to this day the long-lasting impact of the war on drugs. And also perhaps reiterating a point from Ms. Weng that the process is going to be long, especially for the victims. But yeah, so far we have stayed together and we have been in solidarity, and we also would like to segue to that to the support given by our organizers of this side event, Fasten Up for Franciscans International, PARA, who has organized this, and also Forum Asia. And we hope that in the next few years, and particularly this year is very important, as Dr. Nimia mentioned, we will have the elections next year. And so we hope that you continue to monitor the in this 5 years. And perhaps I could just ask our speakers to have a very quick final wrap up, if you can just your final words, and yeah, before we end. Perhaps Ms. Wang, I'll start with you.
This message I would like to give to the families of victims who are with us now, joining us now, to stay united and consolidated, because there are going to be next steps that we need to take now along the way. And so the expectation that you want really to achieve at the end, that you will achieve this expectation at the end. So just stay firm, consolidated, and strong. And we are here to support you. We are here, all our the field rights also, and Forum Asia, PARA, the networks of human rights defenders are here to support you always, and for the international community to be active participant. We call on them also to be active participant in the norm, creative rule, and undertake or pass a resolution that will direct the Philippines to comply with its international human rights obligations that it swore to respect.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wang and Dr. Nina.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for this particular event, and for the presence of our international friends and allies. So I'd like to call upon our international friends, allies, and co-human rights defenders to persist in our struggle in claiming and defending the rights of the people, particularly the Filipino people, especially in the midst of all the challenges, the difficulties and problems we are currently facing, particularly the violence, the intimidation and lies that have been hurled against human rights defenders in the country. And I think with your consistent support, consistent support and encouragement, we will prevail. Thank you.
That's a very good parting message, Dr. Simbulan. And with that, we'd like to thank everyone again for joining us here. And we hope you can continue to join us in our future activities and side events. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Christian, we're okay? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So
Thank
sorry
you.
about my
Eh,
technical issues. I'm so sorry.
okay lang po yun. Okay. Tapos na po ang live stream. Thank you po, Ate Joy.
So much.
Salamat po sa
Thank you,
inyo.
Joy. Sige,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Madam, pasend naman ng research nyo.
Ay, hindi,